good evening to all of you. A big welcome. I'm James Heimowitz, president of China Institute, and it's a delight to join all of you for what's going to be a very, very exciting evening, or for those of you joining us from China, a morning there. This is part of a collaboration between China Institute and the Cerica Initiative, which of course is part of the China project. For those of you who are on this call, I know all of you have an interest in our future, in our collective future. And for those of you who don't know China Institute, we were founded in 1926, and we've been helping Americans understand China better through its language, through its culture, through its art, through its business programs. And now with this new initiative, helping future leaders, like those of you who are on this call, think about how we come together and engage on really important and impactful initiatives and projects. One of the things that I always say is, whether we like it or not, we have a shared future. And China is going to continue to have an important voice, an important space on the global platform. And we've had a lot of false starts recently. There's a lot of mistrust, a lot of anger, a lot of all kinds of negative forces out there. And it's so important for us to come together and to look at the next generation. What are we going to nurture? How are we going to engage? How are we going to tackle problems that impact all of us as global citizens? And I'm just delighted to listen to the insight, because I can't think of another topic that impacts us on our planet more than the planet itself. And how do we protect it and look after it and make sure that we're collaborating on issues that impact all of us? So with that in mind, I'd like to turn this over to Anla Chung. Anla wears many hats, some of them at least. Perhaps one of the more important ones is her role as the founder of SupChina, now the China Project, and helping to nurture people to think about how they can be good global citizens. So a big thank you to everyone at Cerica, a big thank you to Anla for helping mentor and nurture people as we think about being important and contributing members of our planet. So over to you, Anla.
Hello and good evening to all of you. Thank you so much, James, for this warm introduction. I have a very soft and warm spot for James because we are partnered at China Institute, where I also am vice chair.
Anla, would you mind starting your video, please?
Yes, I apologize. I thought I did. I apologize. So I just wanted to say I have a very soft spot and a warm spot in my heart for James, because we are aligned together in really advancing U.S. China relations. And we do that both through China Institute, where I've been a trustee for, I'm not quite sure, but more than 15 years. And also we try to do the same thing at both Cerica and the China Project. So thank you so much, James, to partner with us on this particularly eventful event tonight. And I'm also pleased to host this event, co-host this event, because as you know, Climate Talks has been on the shelf for a very short time, but on the shelf by the Chinese government. And just recently after G20, the climate talks have resumed. So I'm thrilled that we could host this tonight. It's very timely, it's very necessary, and we're thrilled to have all these great speakers who are experts in this area. So I am Anla Chang, founder and CEO of the Cerica Initiative. Cerica is a nonprofit organization based in New York. Our mission is to galvanize a global community of change makers to advance positive social impact between the U.S., China, and the rest of the world. It is Cerica's privilege to host the Next Gen Leaders Circle, NGLC, in partnership with China Institute. I was delighted to be at NGLC's inception back in 2018. That year, we started with an intimate gathering of young Chinese American professionals interested in philanthropy and social impact. Today, we are proud that NGLC has grown into a leading member community of next-gen U.S. China leaders, philanthropists, and social innovators. Half our next-gen members are in the U.S. and the other half in China. Their professions span those working in finance, nonprofits, philanthropy, climate, and the arts, to name just a few. But what really unites our next-gen members is their shared mission for philanthropy and social impact, as well as their shared dedication to build bridges between the U.S. and China. This year, their focus is on fostering U.S. China climate collaboration. We can all agree that this work is more timely and important than ever. I applaud this incredible community of young professionals and Cerica, and we are very proud to help lead and guide their efforts. We look forward to this evening's discussion, which convenes climate policymakers, investors, philanthropists, and academics. Now it is my honor to introduce our virtual keynote speaker, His Excellency Mr. Siddhartha Chatterjee, the United Nations Resident Coordinator in China. Mr. Chatterjee is the highest ranking representative of the UN development systems in China. He has more than 25 years of experience in international cooperation, sustainable development, humanitarian coordination, and peace and security. Most recently, Mr. Chatterjee served as the UN Resident Coordinator in Kenya, after holding other leadership positions across the organization, including as resident representative of the UNDP and representative of the United Nations Population Fund in Kenya, and Chief of Staff in the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq. Mr. Chatterjee also held leadership positions with UNICEF in Indonesia, Somalia, South Sudan, and in UN peacekeeping operations with the UN mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mr. Chatterjee has also served in the Red Cross movement as the chief diplomat and head of resource mobilization in Switzerland. Mr. Chatterjee holds a master's degree in public policy from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree from the National Defense Academy in India. We are honored to have Mr. Chatterjee give a virtual keynote. After his keynote, we will hand tonight's panel over to our moderator, Jeremy Goldkorn, editor-in-chief of the China Project and co-host of the Cerica podcast. The China Project is Cerica's sister media platform, as you all know, and I am its founder and chair. Welcome tonight again, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Chatterjee.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, greetings. My name is Siddhartha Chatterjee, and I'm the United Nations Resident Coordinator in China. I want to thank the China Institute, the Cerica Initiative, and the U.S. China Climate Forum for this invitation to speak at this much-needed and timely discussion on the future of China-U.S. climate collaboration. 2022 has been a difficult year for humanity and the planet. Our exploitation of the Earth's resources has led to more climate change, more warming, more floods, more fires, more hunger, more diseases, more forced migration, and more conflicts. From the tragic floods in Pakistan, record heat waves, droughts, and deadly rainfall in China, to forest fires in California and the floods in Florida, the increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters have led to thousands of lives lost and hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. It has placed society's most vulnerable populations at the highest risk of displacement, put global food security at risk, and damaged critical infrastructure. It is thus under this historical juncture that the United Nations welcomes the restarted climate talks between China and the US, an announcement made upon the conclusion of the bilateral meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden, leaders of these two great powers, at the G20 in Indonesia on the 14th of November 2022. A reinitiated high-level dialogue after months-long hiatus between the climate envoys of the world's largest economies and greenhouse emitters gives the world much-needed reassurance and hope in increasingly uncertain times. It is clear how critical the China-US climate collaboration is. From the number of groundbreaking joint agreements to dozens of high-level meetings between the two sides, the two nations have demonstrated within the past decade that they are willing, ready, and committed to working constructively despite their differences for the common good with the seriousness the challenge requires. From the enormous human capital and cutting-edge scientific innovation to manufacturing capacities, each side has unique assets and capabilities to leverage. The climate energy transition that is already underway can be greatly accelerated given the sheer size and significance of China-US collaboration and the importance of their economies and emissions. The US and China together account for 40% of global GDP as well as greenhouse gas emissions. Renewable energy can be made available at increasingly lower costs to consumers across the two economies and for international markets. Climate impact can be scaled up at an unprecedented pace. The two nations' joint leadership and shared influence, as evident in injecting a well-timed morale boost at COP27 just earlier this month, encourages other nations to pledge more ambitious and bolder climate commitments towards a sustainable future. Here I quote China's Special Envoy for Climate Change, Mr. Xie Jinhua, that there is more agreement between the US and China than divergence, making it an area of huge potential for cooperation. End of quote. Some specific areas where there is substantial potential for cooperation, including ensuring a just transition for those working in the fossil fuel industry. For example, oil and gas industry in the United States and the coal industry in China, as the transition away from fossil fuels puts entire communities into jeopardy, where these sectors are one of the main generators of employment. Other areas where this cooperation could prove important include the development of regulatory frameworks and environmental standards, policies focused on decarbonization and green technologies, and ensuring that there is technology transfer to developing countries to allow them to rapidly decarbonize, ensure a greener and a more sustainable future. There is both goodwill and critical national interest that should be considered equally in this re-engagement. Each side's ambitious climate agenda will only benefit from enhanced engagement. By putting aside their differences to consider the future of humanity, China-US climate collaboration can become an oasis that shall not again turn into a desert. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reasons to be hopeful about the future. With the recent closing of COP27 in Egypt, two key outcomes are a groundbreaking agreement on the new fund to provide money for loss and damage, and the reinitiated China-US climate dialogue. I wish to recall and emphasize remarks from the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, at the beginning of COP27, and he said, and I quote, "The two largest economies, the United States and China, have a particular responsibility to join efforts to make the Climate Solidarity Pact a reality. This is our only hope for meeting our climate goals." End of quote. This re-engagement lays the foundation for a world with a greater chance to limit the rise of global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to continue pursuing the efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. We must also remember that the climate crisis is not a standalone issue that is solely the responsibility of governments. It is also not simply a bilateral issue. The world needs to unite to safeguard the future of humanity and our planet. We need greater cross-sector collaboration, enhanced public-private partnerships in all sectors of the economy to accelerate innovative, differentiated solutions to address the impact of climate change, as well as rising greenhouse gas emissions. Every move, every step matters. I will stop here and pass it on to the moderator. I wish you all very fruitful and successful deliberations. Thank you very much. 谢谢.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And if the panelists could get ready to turn their video on, that'd be great. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. I'm the editor-in-chief of the China Project, and I will moderate tonight. Our question for the night or morning, depending on where you are, is after the Biden-Xi handshake, is U.S. China climate collaboration about to heat back up? There may be somewhat of a contradiction in that question. Is efforts to cool the climate, are they heating up? And as someone who spends almost every waking hour, and certainly every working hour, thinking about China and its relationship with the outside world, you have to color me a little skeptical that you can put the words United States and China and collaboration together right now and hope to make any sense at all. But I'm hoping that our panelists today will be able to cure me of some of my cynicism. And we do have some experts on the topic tonight. Andrew Chung has been a tech investor and entrepreneur for over 20 years with deep experience in climate tech and health tech at his own 1955 capital, which focuses on sustainability in energy, food, agriculture, and also in his prior work as general partner at Kostler Ventures, a celebrated venture capital firm with the world's largest sustainable technology venture portfolio. Andrew is a Harvard grad with a degree in math. He advised the Obama White House on advanced manufacturing. He's a musician, and I'm led to believe a former finalist in the show Hong Kong Idol, but he will have to confirm that fact. We also have Ma Jun, who is simply put a legend in China environmental circles. He's the founding director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs and the author of China's Water Crisis. He led the development of China's first environmental public database in 2006. And then the Blue Map, which is a mobile app that visualizes environmental and climate data to help the public monitor corporate emissions using micro reports against environmental violations, which is an extraordinary thing to be doing in China. Among many other honors, he's received the Asia Game Changer Award from Asia Society this year. Elizabeth Knapp, who I've known for many years, too many, I'm afraid, Elizabeth, as old Beijing residents. I no longer live in Beijing, but Elizabeth is there, and she is a person who makes a difference in the world. She has served as the regional director and chief rep China for the Ford Foundation since 2013, overseeing the foundation's grant-making related to China and operations in the country. She first moved to China in 1998, to be the American co-director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies, which is also a legendary institution. And since then has held some of the most high-power jobs in business, media, and nonprofits in China and connected to China. We're just getting started. We have two more introductions. One more introduction, excuse me. Professor Li Xuhui is Sarah Schallenberger Brown Professor of Meteorology and director of the Yale Center for Earth Observation and program coordinator of the Yale Tsinghua dual degree program. One of the focuses of his research activity is the biophysical effects of land use on the climate system, which is amazing because we're going to be able to talk about some of the really meaty issues about climate change and global warming that we would not otherwise be able to get into. His other ongoing projects include investigating greenhouse gas fluxes in the environment in forests, croplands, and lakes, and the carbon cycle generally. So if audience has specialist questions, please put them in the Q&A. So let's get on with the panel. You are in good hands, my dear audience. The first question is kind of going, I'm asking you to cure me of my cynicism that I mentioned right away. Like, do any of you see potential for U.S.-China climate cooperation increasing, given that there's been somewhat of a thaw in U.S.-China relations? COP27 seemed to be, at least one could say there were good vibes between the United States and China. And maybe I can start with you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Jeremy, for that question. And indeed, we have known each other for a long time, and be careful, I might tell some stories about you in Beijing in the old days. But really, first of all, I just really want to thank the China Institute and Cerica and the Next Generation Leadership Circle for this opportunity. And I'm really humbled by this panel, and I'm a bit embarrassed that I was the first person to be asked to comment on this. So just really, really quickly, the Ford Foundation is an American grant-making foundation that funds other people to do amazing work. And we don't work concretely on this question of the U.S. China climate change sort of partnership. So I am not a deep expert here. But what I can say after years and years of just observing and participating in U.S. China relations in general is that I tend to share a little bit of Jeremy's skepticism, or that just to say that I am very, very encouraged by the fact that things are back on track and that this conversation has started again between China and the United States. I do think that the relationship broadly is still in a fragile state, and it is difficult to, it could go off the rails again, or climate change could keep us on track. I do think personally that what this shows, I think, is that it's important for the United States and China to try to put the things that they disagree about that are going to be very difficult to resolve in any current quick way a little bit to the side. And as Anla said in the beginning, the two largest economies in the world, two of the biggest leading countries in the world, if they could just lift up their eyes and look to global public goods as a place where the United States and China and others can come together to sort of solve global problems, I do feel that is the direction that we need to be moving. So for example, to center the global problem and not to center the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. So we put climate change at the center. It's not only the United States and China that can come together around that, but it's all the countries that are affected across the global south, in Europe, Australia, Japan. There's many, many actors that need to come together to solve this problem. And so I do appreciate this idea of centering the global governance issue and decentering the kind of bilateral relationship between the United States and China that sometimes is a conflicting one, and just to try to shift our kind of viewpoint a little bit. And I am hopeful that that is what we're seeing happening. And I hope that it continues, but I'll stop there. I'd love to hear what others have to say.
May I turn to Professor Lee, because in some ways you perhaps are most directly involved at the nexus of this, because you, at least your role with the Yale Tsinghua program, you kind of are seeing in some ways both the bird's eye and the worm's eye view of this problem. How are you feeling about the way the United States and China are talking to each other, or not, when it comes to environmental issues?
I'm both optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, right? Optimistic because science of climate change is without borders, and that has been like that since the time of IPCC. So IPCC has this paradigm of data sharing and sharing modeling framework, and make the effort really global. And that effort has been ongoing, and that has not been affected by the tension between the two countries too much. But since you also mentioned the dual degree program, I would say though, when it comes to actually solving the climate problems, we do need to do the groundwork. For example, we need to do capacity building, build capacities across in two countries. And that actually has been affected. In our dual degree program, draw students from Tsinghua to come and study environmental management, and students in Tsinghua study the engineering aspect, the technological aspect of the environment, and they come here to look at the management side of the environment. But because of the tension, many of the students actually would now have difficulty because they are sponsored by the China Scholarship Council, and that is a barrier to getting a visa, right? So that is affected. And I also want to comment on earlier point that our keynote speaker made. He emphasized the importance of technological transfer. And on the paper, it's really attractive. I think it's great. I think if you want to solve climate problem, you do need green technology, you do need energy efficient technology, and technology being available to everybody. But in reality, that's not the case, right? In reality, we have this trade barrier So that's in place. I don't think that's going to go away. So my colleagues are suffering, and my colleagues in China are suffering because they need instruments to monitor carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Very good instruments. Instruments are made in the United States. But now with the trade barrier, with the tariff on the instrument, they now pay a lot more money in order to get those instruments. Those are sort of are the things that are barriers.
Professor Lee, may I ask, is that just tariffs making them more expensive, or are there also restrictions because the United States is increasingly regulating exports of advanced technologies? Is that affecting the kind of instruments that people in your field need as well?
That does too. For example, we have in the United States, we have this very advanced technology monitoring methane emission from industrial facilities, the thermal sensors, right? And you have to have special permit, I think, from the Department of Commerce in order to purchase one from the United States. And that's a very tough thing to get. And in terms of CO2 monitoring sensors, those sensors don't need special permit, but they are 25-30% more expensive than like 4 years ago. Okay. Maybe I should stop there and let other panelists speak a little bit before we circle back.
Because I'm worried, I'm gonna ask Majin depressing questions about polluted water. So I'm gonna first ask Andrew, because you are somebody who invests in the future. You must be some kind of optimist or crazy. What are you seeing in terms of technological innovations and in terms of perhaps cross-border investments where we can look to for some sunniness?
Yes, I think by having the label venture capitalist, it opts me into the optimist bucket. And I've been fortunate that over the last 20 years, I've been involved in the sustainability area through some bright times and some dark times, and as well as watched the U.S. China relationship unfold over the last 2 decades in parallel. So, before I get to that question, maybe I'll just hit briefly on your skepticism question. One of the areas that, one of the memories that I have that gives me a lot of continued optimism that U.S. and China still have a lot of room for collaboration dates back to 2014 when I was part of a trade mission. It was the Obama presidential trade mission to China. I accompanied the Secretary of Energy, Penny Pritzker, Liz Sherwood Randall, and the Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker, as part of this trade mission. And there was a presentation that was given to the Chinese leadership where a lot of tense topics were discussed, whether it was human rights or cybersecurity, South China Sea, and it was very tense. The moment that the conversation shifted to environmental technology, there was a de-icing effect. All of a sudden, the audience started to tune their translation machines. They leaned forward, they started taking notes, they got very engaged. And it really gave me this belief that I hold still today, that technology ends up being the olive branch that can connect these two nations as well as other nations globally. So that's my source of optimism, that this is such a global issue. And I think someone mentioned that the emissions issue knows no borders, and it is going to be advanced technology that is going to solve some of these issues, and ones that particularly relate to their country's survival. So I think in terms of the U.S. China piece, very difficult. Partnerships aren't easy. The tension makes it very difficult. Tariffs, policies make it difficult. But at the end of the day, because our societies respectively are dependent on some sort of change to improve the situation, I do think it gives me rays of hope that that's possible. To your point about technology, and I think maybe building on the last panelist's point about some of the difficulties, I do think that it is advanced technologies that bring the countries together. And there's certainly difficulties with regard to how tech transfer works. But in both cases, the US and China are developing their own sets of technologies that are quite compelling. Both sides have developed some form of supply chain that is compelling. What needs to happen is technologies that really are breakthrough technologies or moonshot technologies that aren't easy to replicate, that aren't easy for another academic institution to develop or a scientific lab to develop, that gets attention on both sides. The ability to scale the technology and be able to build factories at a fast pace, that is compelling on both sides. And so I think, as I look at a lot of the different categories within sustainability and climate change mitigation, whether it's renewable energy, storage, sustainable food production, to grid infrastructure upgrading, that whole range of areas, it's the advanced technologies that will cause both sides to have to figure out some way to collaborate in order to commercialize these technologies. And one of the reasons why I believe that it transcends some of the political issues is that in some of the cases, a U.S. developed technology may see some initial funding and attention here in the U.S., but at some point they may hit a funding gap. They may hit an inability to commercialize to full scale. If China has a sharp enough need for that technology and has a survival-driven demand for that technology, the ability to pair the funding and commercialization resources and supply chain resources with a technology that would otherwise not see light of day in the US becomes the optimal way of finding collaboration opportunities. So just some observations both on your skepticism as well as how technology partnerships could come into play.
I knew I could count on you for some sunniness, Andrew. Martin, let me turn to you and ask you, I'd like to ask about international collaboration together with your projects. But first, could you talk a little bit about Blue Map, the mobile app that you've created, and what kind of things you're learning about the environment in China from it?
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for having me. And you mentioned about water. I researched about water pollution and water biodiversity, freshwater biodiversity damage in the 1990s. And I came to the conclusion that the issue, the pollution was so severe and the magnitude is so big and complex that we have to, we need extensive participation to address this problem. But the prerequisite for that is access to information. I trust information can play a vital role. And so with that in mind, we built Blue Map database from 2006 and started compiling the data. At that time, the pollution level was, as you cited, very severe. 28% of the nationally monitored water sections were in the category worse than category 5, meaning that they're running black, they're good for no use at all. And 300 million people at that time exposed to water pollution, to polluted water. They don't have access to sufficient safe drinking water. And but during all these years, gradually we have seen the changing policy and the Blue Map we developed continue to use that to compile the data. At the beginning, the data was very limited, only annual some monitoring data for some very, very scattering monitoring points. But today, that was very, very different. 20,000 monitoring stations on our rivers and lakes and drinking water sources and also coastal seas. We got that data rather regularly, most of them monthly data across China. And also the Blue Map also compiled the data of all these violators of wastewater discharge standards. And at the beginning, only 2,000 records of violations, but today that records have topped 2.6 million. And tens of thousands of largest.
Martin, may I interrupt and ask how are people reporting the violations? Do they send photos, upload photos, or text, or what's the process?
Yeah, in two ways. One of them is that they tap into our data. As I mentioned, we have some of the largest wastewater and air emitters. They have online monitoring, so people can we visualize them. Those who are in violations will be turned into color red, and the others color blue. So people will share that on social media and tag in the official account of the local environmental agencies, making that a file, filing that as micro-reporting. Tens of thousands of such reporting have been made in those 8 days, during our pollution efforts. And then, another way is, as you mentioned, directly take the picture of the polluted river. Two ministries in China have created a reporting platform against black and smelly river, and Blue Map have been connected with this in a way that our users can take a picture and upload this through our app directly into the reporting platform. And within 7 working days, initial response and then follow-up checks, and the feedback will go back to the cell phone of the citizen who reported this. So again, more than 10,000 of such reporting have been made, and we have seen so far more than 2,400 black smelling rivers have been turned into more normal water situation. I mentioned about 28% used to be in the category worse than category 5, and today that indicator have dropped to, the proportion have dropped to 1.2% last year. So we have seen some real progress made. Having said that, we're still facing a rather modest water quality standard. And then on the air side, we still have regions which still suffered from air pollution, smog, and progress have been made in terms of air quality control as well. Part of that is also based on all this public participation, not just public participation, talking about, this global collaboration. So many corporations, including some of the largest brands in the United States, from America, like Apple, like Dell, like Levi's, like Nike, they all turn into the Blue Map before they sign contract. They compare their list of suppliers with our list of violators. We're tracking millions of companies, and literally 12 million companies, their environmental performance, and they have helped to motivate among them 20,000 who used to have violations, and now they motivate them to enhance their performance.
Now to get on to something that maybe is slightly more difficult to answer, how do you see your projects, the Blue Map and other initiatives you're involved in, working internationally? Is it still possible to collaborate with American organizations? And if so, how do you do that?
That's what I want to, I want to say that I agree with all the distinguished guests. I agree with that we are having real, Elizabeth mentioned about the tension, and Professor Lee mentioned about that as well. Yeah, I fully agree with that. Geopolitical tension is there, is real, and we could have a wish list, but that simply, in the foreseeable future, it's very hard to change that. And so with that, we have to take that as a reality. We're very happy to see that the two sides now can resume their discussion, resume collaboration. I'm sure, the most excited, the person who's the most excited would be Special Envoy Xie Zhenhua. I listened to him recall, how intensive interaction he had with Secretary Kerry, and they obviously they share some real passion, and they have good chemistry. So that's a real asset between our two countries. So they must be very excited. We have a long list of tasks that has yet to be fulfilled, in our joint declaration signed in COP26. So I hope those can be resumed. But we have to recognize that in China, in the United States, we still have the politics there. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen, 2 years later, and in the next round of election, next round of politics. And within China, we're facing this real challenge of the transformation of our energy supply structure. All this power rationing and power shortage, and have highlighted the very fact that this transition to low carbon is going to be much tougher than expected, and so that's why coal has been again tapped as the resources to ensure energy security, not just in China but by many other major economies globally. So we have to recognize that those will all be roadblocks in our collaboration. So I hope that we can broaden our base of collaboration, not just government to government, not just all this top down, but between the citizens, the people, and also our cornerstone is the trade relationship that will not very easily change in the foreseeable future. So how to bring these trade relations? I think that's with all this commitment made by all these big multinational companies from Paris to Glasgow, scope 3, the supply chain carbon footprint must be part of that. I think that's going to bond our two countries very, 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 very closely. So that's why our new blue map for zero carbon, which can compile all this data on the regions, province by province, city by city, and also encourage corporate carbon accounting and disclosure, have been now again extensively tapped by some of the leading American brands, and they have motivated the supply chain in China to account and disclose more than 60 million tons of carbon dioxide just this year alone on the blue map. So that gives me hope. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Thank you, Andrew. I was saying, perhaps we can talk a little bit about specific technologies. And Professor Lee, I'd like to ask you, do you see any hope for stuff to do with the carbon cycle, carbon sequestration? Are there fixes, technological fixes, that are actually realistic, that may help us to cope with the likelihood that we can't just stop polluting and emitting and continue to live the way we are, that there's no overnight switch to carbon neutral, that China and other countries will continue to burn, and the United States will continue to burn coal for the foreseeable future, essentially. Are there technologies that are actually possible that might be able to mitigate the harms that we pretty much know we're going to cause?
So that's where the pessimism comes in, right? I've been in the school for a long time. 20 years ago, we were talking about carbon sequestration, industrial carbon sequestration, mineral carbon sequestration, sequestration at industrial facilities, carbon capturing carbon from open air. That technology, back then we had somebody from Colombia, promising that there would be technology where you could just hang something out in air and you'll scrap carbon from air. And that never materialized 20 years later. Back then, we had high hope. We thought, wow, if his technology becomes successful, he will be a Nobel Prize winner. But it turns out Nobel Prize went to somebody else who did climate modeling instead of carbon sequestration. We do in our school, we have a very strong program called the Natural Climate Solutions. There, we are trying to use natural ecosystems, managing natural ecosystems, wetland, forest, agricultural land. Well, agricultural land is more of a managed land, and manage the landscape in such a way that minimize carbon loss and enhance carbon uptake. So that is maybe a positive step forward. But then if you put the number against the amount of emission, you become quickly pessimistic, because the amount of carbon potential through natural climate solutions is really not that big. And so we have to cut emission. And we know that's a very difficult task, given the point that Margin mentioned about energy security and all that. But there's really no other way of solving the climate problem, other than bringing down emissions, right? So that's one aspect to it. The other aspect, also maybe tied to technology side, is that we have to adapt. We have been hearing about hitting this 1.5 degree target or 2 degrees target, but I feel like it's very difficult, given so much political divides among different nations, and it's back and forth, and so we need to be prepared to adapt to future warmer climate. And one thing I'm really worried about is actually climate in cities. A lot of people live in cities, and a lot of cities are getting really, really hot. And in climate science, we have a lethal threshold. When you combine temperature and humidity together, that lethal threshold is what we call wet bulb temperature. I don't want to get into technicality of that too much, but the point is that when you warm up air, you also humidify the air, and then the two combined will become deadly in many places. And those cities become basically uninhabitable unless we have air conditioning. And that's you create a vicious cycle. Using air conditioning, you release more carbon, right? You use more energy, and more energy means more carbon in air. So you create that vicious positive cycle. And so there's where technology comes in. Perhaps we can come up with low energy kind of cooling facilities, and then let them be available not only in the United States. In the United States, we are not too worried because we have high adaptation capacity. What we worry about are those maybe cities in some cities in China, or more broadly cities in, say, India, in the global south, where they don't have access to that kind of AC infrastructure. So those are two things that worry us a lot.
May I?
Yeah, I want that smile.
This is certainly an area where I am incredibly optimistic against the backdrop of a very daunting problem. So I think all of the academics that are on this call have studied how difficult and pernicious this problem is, and what type of challenge that we face as a human race to be able to overcome it. Let me just take us back in time for a moment. I think, Jeremy, we're probably about the same age, somewhere in our 40s. And when we were in college, not everyone carried a cell phone in their pocket. In 2004, January 1, Facebook didn't exist. 2007, January 1, the iPhone didn't exist. And just 4 or 5 years ago, TikTok didn't exist, right? And if you think about the way that these things have fundamentally changed the way that we all live today, it's a very important reminder that dramatic revolutionary change can happen with technology breakthroughs. So how does that translate on the climate side? Around the time when you and I were toddlers, or in elementary school, a solar cell cost about 100 times more to make than it does today. 100 times more. So if you think about even this conversation about renewable energy, when I started looking at sustainability 20 years ago, it was almost a bit of a joke. If you had a CIO of a major utility coming in and we were talking about these high efficiency solar cells, which by the way, back then were like, 18%. Now everything's 18% or 20 or 22. They weren't even thinking about a world where solar could have significant penetration because of the cost. Let's look at LED lights. LED light bulbs follow a similar type of cost improvement curve as solar has. It's called Heitz's law. It's very well known. It's kind of like Moore's law in semiconductors. The cost of the LED has dropped by an order of magnitude since I started looking at this area. So a lot of I think the experts in various fields have a very difficult time processing a world where there's a 90% difference in a cost, performance, or economic issue. Just like, the folks could never have predicted how cell phones have completely revolutionized the way that we communicate and live. So I think in that regard, whether it's solar cells, LED light bulbs, the cost of lithium-ion batteries weren't invented until around the time when we were in college, right? Well, they weren't even invented yet, right? And now, of course, they're in every single device that we're all using to look at the Zoom. And so if you look at the climate problem, I'm working with companies that are doing things ranging from converting carbon gases directly into valuable fuels and chemicals at the point of source. So this is kind of skipping over carbon sequestration, capture, sequestration in that whole cycle. This is taking smoke that comes out of a factory and biochemically converting it into a fuel or chemical, or something that could go into apparel or other types of consumer products. The company is called Lanzatech, and that actually was a great example of a U.S. China collaboration that I'm happy to talk about later. Another company that we're investors in is called Nature's Find, FYND. They, we believe, are the first alternative protein platform company that can produce impossible foods like food products across all the food groups. So it's not just a burger patty, but they can produce
eggs,
products,
chicken,
all the food groups. Right, exactly. Like think about a 8-course meal that you could serve using products from there that don't require any animals, that don't require any farmland, any precious water, the carbon use. It reduces all of that resource consumption for animal husbandry by 98%, right? Which is very much needed. So breakthrough technology. Yet another company is working on a new generation of battery technology that improves existing state-of-the-art batteries by 5 times in terms of the lifetime of these batteries. So if you think about just the very simple idea that if I can take a battery and I can make it live longer by 5 times, I only need 1/5 of the number of batteries to do the same thing. And so I've reduced my carbon footprint of producing these batteries by 80%, right? So I think that some of these types of things give me a lot of optimism. I think it gives me a lot of reason to wake up and continue to search for these technologies, because it's hard to predict what happens when you have that magnitude of change. And I am confident that many smart scientists across the globe, not just in the US and China, are working on some incredible things that give me hope for the future. And the last note that I'll mention is just, Tesla. Think about 10 years ago, the level of skepticism about whether or not Elon Musk could commercialize. It was almost a crazy notion that he could ever create a vehicle and displace Ford or GM in terms of market value. And now today, if I'm kind of going outside when I do my drop off in the morning in Silicon Valley, it's a lineup of Teslas. It's sort of, that's what everyone drives here now.
It's the private school bus.
It's the private school bus. It's unbelievable how
amazing.
That's changed in technology, right?
Well, yeah, good. That's fortified my spirit somewhat. Elizabeth, I know you kind of mentioned, and I know for China, you don't really work directly on climate change, but you do seek to support an ecosystem around impact investing. And that strikes me as, I think you'll have sage advice for like the ordinary person. Like if we want to support finding a solution to climate change, and we believe that the United States and China are the 2 biggest polluters in the world, the 2 biggest contributors to climate change. What should we be thinking about? Where should we be focusing our attention in order to actually make a difference?
So thank you for the question. I want to sort of circle back to a couple of things that some other people said first, and then I'll try to answer that question. So to sort of so the Ford Foundation, so this is my perspective, right? Because I'm working at Ford. And so the main thing that we're actually trying to do is to address inequality in all of its forms. And so a lot of the work that we do comes at questions of climate change and other questions from the point of view of inequalities and making sure that solutions are, not only end up being sustainable, that are also equitable. So when we think about climate change at Ford, and we have a whole body of work called Natural Resources and Climate Change, but what it enters that question from the point of view of the indigenous people and the landholders, from their indigenous land use rights, from that perspective, getting to Dr. Lee's point about if you can manage forests and other kind of both managed lands and wild lands better, then they become a powerful positive impact on the ways of controlling climate change. So our view is, if you give indigenous people more rights to steward their own forests and their own lands better, that's a positive contributor to climate change. But at the same time, to the emissions part, we're also, so that gets to thinking about extractive industries, both agriculture as well as mining and fossil fuels and other extractive industries, and how do you sort of balance the need for the extracted mineral or whatever and the land use and the kind of complicated relationship between all of that and climate change, right? So that's sort of the complicated ball that we're trying to sort of tease out when we work on our climate change work. And it's complicated to my sort of very, very layperson's understanding, because one solution may then create a different problem, right? So if you need certain kind of minerals for the new lithium batteries, and the new lithium batteries are amazing, but mining those minerals is having another negative impact, then what's the net impact, right? Is it better to have more lithium batteries, or is it better to not mine the minerals? So I think that's a big open question. And similarly, thinking about what we call the just energy transition, and you mentioned this, Jeremy, at the beginning, is, some of the just energy transition ends up, or I guess it was the UN, anyway, someone mentioned how sometimes
it wasn't me, but I'm happy to take the credit.
You can take the credit for it, but that it creates, employment problems if you're getting rid of gigantic industries in the global south, right? So you have to sort of think about all these things. So I kind of throw that out there as kind of a big set of questions, and I would love to hear what other panelists think about that. And to your actual question, so when we think about, so impact investing in Ford's way of thinking is really, so ESG investing is kind of a do no harm kind of investment strategy. And impact investing is sort of to intentionally have an intentional positive impact. And in Ford's case, we're interested in social impacts as well as environmental impacts. And so what we're trying to do both as an investor, because the Ford Foundation has a big endowment, so we're actually an investor in markets. And we're also a field builder around this field of impact investing, both in the United States, globally, and now inside China. So this is a place where I do think the United States and China, it's not really impacted so much by the geopolitics. There is a strong interest in both countries about thinking about how to mobilize capital for public good. And I think Andrew has been giving us many good examples of how that works. And so what we're trying to do in China is build out an ecosystem of institutions and curriculum and fund managers, et cetera, who think in terms of this intentional positive outcome that precedes your financial return. It doesn't negate your financial return, but it precedes it. And then the other part of the work we're trying to do is sort of strengthen capacities, both policy and then institutional capacities, to think about ESG standards in real ways, not just as a greenwashing, but really trying to push the Chinese policy environment and then the capacity of banks and investors to really seriously use these standards. And in particular, in our case, for their investments outside of China, right? So how is China's investment in Indonesia, in Southern Africa, in Peru, impacting the environment, the communities, and the societies in those places? And how can we sort of encourage the Chinese actors to think more completely about that kind of impact in their investment. So stop there. Thanks.
So I kind of drawing on some of what you said about, you know, the transition to clean energy and the problems that it may bring. And we have a question in the Q&A, and to the audience, please put more questions and I'll get to some of the others. But let me start with this one. Chemical batteries are taxing on the world through harsh harvesting of resources. Can we innovate mechanical batteries instead that can store all that energy? I'm going to throw that question out to all of the panelists, if anybody has a way of answering that. But a question I think maybe all of you can comment on is what should we be aware of in the transition to electric vehicles? Because it feels to me a little bit like we're in the moment where Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX and Bitcoin are trading at all-time highs, and you know, celebrities are doing Bitcoin adverts. The electric car industry is starting to feel like that a little bit to me. Everybody agrees it's a good thing. Everybody's piling into it. BYD is huge. Mercedes-Benz and Audi are getting into it. General Motors, of all companies, is making electric cars. And I sometimes wonder, like, what are we missing? How much should we be concerned about the mining margin? Is there water pollution now that is coming from the electrical vehicle industry? Like, what are we missing in the rush to the electric vehicle transition? And I'll open it up to, you know, all of the panelists.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think I very much share the optimism of Andrew, you know, when it comes to technology, and it's eventually we have to address all these global challenges to humanity, to the ecosystem through technology. I think eventually that's the solution, and we're so excited to see that. That technology is still advancing at such a kind of speed. Having said that, you know, we have to also, in the meantime, take care of all this, all the downsides and side effects. You know, we have to highlight those and try to address those, and through the process, you know, create real incentives for good solutions. I think you know, to me, if we want to turn this, all this potential, you know, really try to turn them into business opportunities, then we have to really create a accountability mechanism, you know, accountability mechanism that based on the, you know, disruptive level of transparency and data-driven, you know, so that we can make sure that you know, wherever the we can make sure that all this all the business which are, you know, at this moment part of the problem can be turned into part of the solutions. When it comes to, you know, the electric vehicle, yes, it has a lot of upsides, and eventually the electrification of our transportation system is the future. But at this moment, you know, we also got to keep in mind, you know, the manufacturing process could be quite dirty, and actually, you know, the per unit pollution intensity and carbon intensity is much higher when it comes to e-vehicle still at this moment. So those who fail to take care of this are actually, you know, fail their commitment, you know, fail to the commitment, and are in some sort of a greenwash. I have to put it that way. You know, we continue to do the investigation into the e-vehicle industry, and through the process have highlighted, you know, having exposed pollution problem, you know, water, air, and solid waste, hazardous waste, and problem of the batteries, and and sometimes direct impact on the local communities. And we're happy to see some of the brands started paying attention and started acknowledge the problem and openly address them. But unfortunately, some of the brands, including Tesla, especially particularly Tesla, have failed to make very direct response to this. Although I did see they started forming some sort of management team in China to track this. I think it's very important to manage this. So back to this more fundamental issue of accountability. I mentioned about so many of the brands, make their commitment from Paris to Glasgow, but unfortunately, still many of them still haven't really, be able to put them into real solid action, especially in their supply chain. We have been working on the index called Climate Corporate, Corporate Climate Action Index, and through this index, assess the performance of 1,000 companies, 500 global companies, and 500 locally listed companies. And through the process, we have found that some of the leading ones, like Apple, Dell, and others, have made real good progress. But there are still so many of them who haven't really been able to really tackle this issue. I trust that if we can all pay attention to this issue, particularly from the investors, attention paid by investors, paid by the consumers, then that could generate real incentives for the companies who both have the obligation, the duty, and also the resources to tackle this. And those, only through this we can see that the good technologies developed by Professor Lee and invested by Andrew and impact investment made by Elizabeth. And I think there will be more incentives for this to really happen. And so the last point I want to make, there are so many opportunities. One of them is on the new kind of function of Blue Map app is for our users to take a picture of the daily necessities, whether it's the food you eat or the clothes you purchase, and or all the gadgets you purchase. You take a picture of them, and it can come back with a rough estimate of the carbon footprint of that product. And I do think that the carbon labeling, based on the life cycle assessment of the product, carbon emission factors, we're developing this infrastructure and hoping that this could eventually, help our citizens, as consumers.
Is that something that the U.S. and China and other countries might be able to actually agree on? Is a standardized system of carbon labeling, or is that?
Yeah, I do hope so. I think through the COP process, there are all this discussion and debates, the discussion about the measuring, reporting, and verification mechanism. And I hope that we can all come up with some sort of agreement. But eventually, I think the technology is moving toward that. We're trying to build a life cycle assessment, product life cycle LCA emission factors database, so that we can more accurately measure this and then generate the high quality carbon labeling in a more cost-effective way. I hope eventually, the consumers in America and in China could all tap into this more easily and fundamentally become, make real good green choice.
So let me turn to a question from the Q&A, and please feel free to put in more questions. What are the prospects of U.S.-China collaboration on agricultural decarbonization. And I'd like to split that into two questions. The first for Professor Lee, like, is this something that you are working on at all in the agricultural supply chain? What are the possibilities of decarbonizing it? And then the second part, I'd like to turn to Andrew and ask specifically about lab-grown meat, fake meat. Well, I don't know what the right word, fake meat. I know there's probably a trendier word, but what are the, because I understand there are already quite significant investments of United States venture capital in China. I think Beyond and Impossible Meats are both in China. But let's start with Professor Lee in terms of technologies of agricultural decarbonization. What should the world be looking at?
Well, that's a very loaded question, right? My mind is racing about how to answer that question. So there are many aspects of it. When you say carbon decarbonization of agriculture sector, you're looking at on-site carbon footprint. The amount of nitrogen you put in. By the way, when you put in nitrogen, you consume power. Obviously, that's off-site energy consumption, and nitrogen by itself also releases very powerful greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide. So that should be factored into the consideration. And then you have transportation. When you make banana in Brazil, and then you spend a lot of energy to transport that to Connecticut, where I live, then that's obviously a big part of that picture, right? Local food versus non-local food. And then there's another part of it, meat diet versus vegetable diet. You're talking about consumer habit, something that Marjin was mentioning, actually, using carbon label to help us promote good consumer habit. And that's also a big part of it, right? If you want to decarbonize the agriculture, we have to change our diet habits as well. Maybe eat more vegetable, less beef. Maybe we eat Andrew's artificial beef. That will help reduce the carbon footprint of the agriculture sector. So it's many components to it. Many components to it. And then you also need to think about sometimes when, like in this country, we allocate a lot of land, produce biofuel. That's in cropland, and you produce biofuel and offset carbon reliance on fossil fuel. So those components are all tangled together. And I suppose that the way to do it is to do what we call life cycle assessment, to take the whole picture together. I don't think we can totally decarbonize. That's almost impossible, because you need agriculture is a resource intensive activity. So I don't think we can totally decarbonize, but there are ways to reduce the carbon footprint, right? Through diet change, through no-till practice, and through crop rotation to minimize reliance on synthetic fertilizer. There are ways of reducing the carbon footprint. Good question.
Boy, there's a lot to cover here. I'll try to do it quickly. I think when thinking about decarbonization of agriculture, the stat that I like to opine on is that 300 million pigs died from the African swine fever that went through China several years ago. 300 million. So for the American U.S. based folks here, that's more pigs than we have in our entire country. So imagine you wake up one day and the Wall Street Journal says all of the pigs in the U.S. have been killed by this virus. That's basically kind of what happened before COVID dominated the headlines. And so China and broader Asia has a fundamental protein supply problem. So let's put aside carbon and the carbon impact and the life cycle issue. There is just a fundamental scarcity of this very, very important food product for the fastest growing middle class in the world, right? So there's a huge supply demand mismatch here and a massive issue. I think what the professor was indicating around a lot of the issues around life cycle analysis. And if you kind of think about where are those pieces coming in? Well, if you map where the arable land is and scarcity of water resources, as well as just localized methane and carbon emissions, they all kind of map to animal husbandry really, really well, right? So there is absolutely an importance and a critical need in China and other parts of Asia to reduce the carbon footprint by shifting their protein production to other safer, more emission-free processes. So your question about clean meat, new protein, alternative protein, pick your term, new food tech, whatever that term is a very important solution, I believe, in over the long term. When I was a general partner at Coastal Ventures, we were the first investors in Impossible Foods and Ripple, in Kite Hill, and a bunch of the first wave food tech companies that now have become quite successful, household names, right? And
may I interrupt, Andrew? So you're investing in Chinese companies that are making this type of artificial meat, are you?
no, we're investing in U.S. based companies.
US-based companies. And so are they marketing it in China?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in my opinion,
I mean, because I just want to say that until the Chinese people start eating the fake meat, that's when I'll be convinced.
Yeah.
With Americans and the fake meat, I mean, there's been spam and stuff for a long time in this country.
Yeah.
We don't have a good record in America of good tasting fake meat.
Well, it's interesting because in China, the folks that encounter this new category will say that they have been doing this for a long time. So if you think about, about a significant percentage of the Chinese population is lactose intolerant, right? So the idea of using plant-based alternatives to dairy products has been around for a long time. The ability to use different flavors and versions of tofu to be able to create meat-like substances has been around for a long time. I think what is novel and new about this wave that is actually not as far from the China mindset as one might think, is that for the first time, we're using new food science techniques to create products that have the texture, the feel, the response when you cook it on a wok or a griddle that mimics the real thing. And that hasn't really been tackled quite in that way before. But in terms of the Chinese market, we actually did a very deep analysis of the plant-based food product categories. And remarkably, there's billion-dollar companies across the board in all of these, right? So that's actually been something that's been accepted by the Chinese, but it's this new angle of saying that I'm actually going to take, like if I'm going to make dumplings, I'm going to make that dumpling product taste as good, if not better, than the original product. And it's healthier, it doesn't come from an animal, and it's an equivalent. I'm not sacrificing for the sake of something that's healthier, right? So I think that's a good question, but that's part of what this new wave is all about, and I think it's an important category that deserves watching, and a lot of these companies are trying to find ways to commercialize in China, and in some cases to good effect. I did want to get to a couple of the questions that were in the chat. There were two questions that I thought were very interesting. If I may, Jeremy, on the storage side.
Please do. I was going to say that, and the other panelists too. If you see anything in the Q&A that you'd like to answer, please go ahead after Andrew. But please go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so Amy asked the question about perpetual motion machines or mechanical storage versus chemical. And I think that's a very good question. As a venture capitalist who's been doing this for 20 years, I've seen all kinds of things, all kinds of perpetual motion machines that promise limitless energy, right? And a more kind of down to earth version of that might be, a flywheel that's storing up energy, or a smaller device that uses mechanical components to be able to store up energy. I have not, and the market has not seen one that gets to the level of energy density and storage capability that competes with lithium ion yet. But that's not to say that that can't be done. As devices get smaller, as you're able to fabricate things on the quantum scale, as you're able to manage things, there are different vectors that are being developed in other disciplines that are leading us to the physics that may get us there. So I continue to look, and I think it's interesting. But if you go outside of that, there already are different companies that are working on using the temperature differential that is stored in salt or molten materials that aren't really your traditional chemical-based process, that are a more natural way of storing energy as well at the grid scale. So again, entrepreneurs are working on this type of thing. But if you take this to what is more perhaps within the realm of what we typically will talk about in terms of energy storage, company that I mentioned earlier that is looking to extend the lifetime of a battery, they're doing it with lead acid batteries. Lead acid batteries are in 99.99% of cars that are on the planet. And every OEM already knows how to use that. It's a $50 billion annual market. There's already infrastructure out there. There's recycling infrastructure that's already out there. So what our company has done is they replaced the non-active material with a silicon plate that extends the lifetime by 5 times. And the energy density boosts by a multiple as well. So you're taking something that already is out there. There already is a manufacturing infrastructure out there. There's already customers that buy this type of product. There's no dependency on lithium, obviously, which is a difficult product to mine. And yet you are increasing the lifetime of these batteries. And again, the ability to use them, you reduce the footprint by 80% off the block without changing anything, right? Except some modifications to the manufacturing process on site. So that's one method of saying how we can adapt storage so that you're not using the same type of resources or the dirty manufacturing process that is out there. You're taking something and making it a lot more efficient and a lot cheaper and easier to do. Another technology in storage is solid state battery technology. We were the first investors in a company called QuantumScape, which is a solid state battery technology that went public a couple of years ago to big fanfare. They're using a semiconductor manufacturing process to produce batteries. So it's not a kind of dirty, slurry process that lithium ion battery companies use. It's a clean room semiconductor process that is more similar in a lot of ways to how you make the chips that are in your computer, which is quite a clean process compared to how batteries are typically made. And so again, you're thinking about a different way of creating these types of products with other after effects in mind or secondary effects in mind. The last point that I'll mention, another gentleman mentioned something about adoption and how can you perhaps force the adoption of some of these technologies. I'll leave it to the folks that deal a lot more with policy to comment. I think it's very difficult, with a lot of the incentives because administrations change, policies change, technologies change. And so the way I like to look at partnerships is really situations where you're compelling a partner to work with you and adopt this because it's so fundamentally different and impactful for them that it changes their business. So LanzaTech, which was the company that converts waste gas into fuels and chemicals and consumer products, their first partner was in China. Baogang and Shougang are two of the largest steel manufacturers in the world, and they had issues with their emissions. The local governments were complaining that the 24 factories that you have are producing too much carbon waste. You need to do something about it. And so enter our technology. We had a way of taking the gas and converting it into a useful chemical on the other end. So it became something that it wasn't forcing anyone to do anything. It was just an important solution for that Chinese partner to consider for the viability of their business. And they ended up investing in our first 2 pilot factories.
Andrew, I'm going to cut you off there and pose one last question to all of the panelists. And I'll give you about a minute each, starting with Elizabeth, and then let's go to Maju and then Professor Lee and end off with you, Andrew. So the question comes from Valentina Xu in the Q&A. And she asks, what is each panelist's best practice as an individual that us in the audience can apply day to day to make a positive climate difference?
I saw that question and I was hoping you weren't going to ask it, and I was thinking.
And you knew I would.
So the one thing I'll try to answer the question really, but when I read that question, what crossed my mind was in the early 2020, in the very beginning stages of the pandemic globally, and particularly here in New York, I had this idea, like, what if the entire world just shut down between Christmas and Chinese New Year every single year? No planes, no cars, everybody's riding a bike, restaurants are closed, and we just all take a break. And maybe that would be good for the planet if we just had a global shutdown for 6 weeks every year. And I would be in favor of that. and I would participate in that. But on my daily life, I mean, I have to say, I probably don't, you know, I'm like everybody else. I don't use plastic bags. I try to eat less meat. You know, a lot of the things I think we all try to do, turn off lights. I don't buy so much fast fashion. I really do try to pay attention to all my behaviors and try to make them more sustainable. I do think that the big changing, the way we're going to really change this, though, is less by individual decisions about what kind of bags to carry their groceries in, because I do think we're really it should be sort of there are big companies and there are big systemic sort of embedded ways that we live that go far beyond how many plastic bags we use, that are where the incentives are baked in.
So if I may
Yes,
summarize,
well,
it's
sorry.
consume less and call the powerful to account.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, my turn.
Thank you, thank you. And I of course, I agree with Elizabeth, and I do hope that we can all pay more attention to the performance of the brands, you know, and the carbon footprint of their products. And I think the new technologies give us opportunity to better understand that. We talked about all this, you know, food industry's carbon footprint, and if we can make our people better understand that every kilo of beef, you know, 60 kilos of carbon footprint, and then you know, every one of us, I hope, can in our daily life can clear all our plate instead of having all this food waste. You know, food waste in China every year can feed 200 million people. So I think there are ways for us to consume, you know, in a more responsible way. You know, textile industry emission is put together is higher than the global air and marine transportation put together. So I think if we understand that, then, you know, we will not try to overreach in our consumption. We need to consume more responsibly. It doesn't mean that we need to compromise on our quality of life, but now there are opportunities for us to all pay attention to the performance. There are data available, you know, particularly, you know, in a country like China, which is still the factory of the world. I hope that all the consumers can pay attention to the data now generated on that. Thank you.
Professor Lee.
So in one of my classes, I ask students to calculate their carbon footprints. Right, they are those calculators online, and you know, you turn on light or use LED light or not using LED light. You eat meat or not eating meat. You change your car from a gasoline vehicle to electric vehicle. It turns out, you know, the biggest ticket item is none of those. The biggest ticket item is flying. If you reduce your flight by just one, all those that accounts for all the savings that you can get from all the other sources. So in some way, that this pandemic helps in a way that's now we reduce our carbon footprint by doing virtual meetings. You know, that's what we are doing now, right? By doing virtual meetings and flying to New York or driving to New York and have this panel discussion. So I think if you start to pay attention like that, you begin to see, wow, okay, maybe we should, like to the point, Elizabeth's point, maybe you should not celebrate holidays. We maybe should not have family gatherings just for the sake of family gathering, and think more about saving the planet. I'll stop there.
Andrew.
I first off, I so appreciate everything that has been said on this panel and take a lot of it to heart. I think that I guess my best practice, and it's sort of natural for me and what I do, is to recognize that there's no one size fits all solution, and it's a portfolio approach. there is not a single thing that if we do a lot more of that one thing is going to solve the problem. It's going to be 100 things or 1,000 things that have to happen in concert in order to address the climate change issue. And I think I would just encourage everyone to recognize that and think about, what are the 5 to 10 things that fit your lifestyle and fit your personality and your passion that you would actually adhere to do that. And whether that's installing a solar panel in your house or Nest thermostats in your house or eating alternative meats or investing in clean technologies, pick the areas that you feel like you could do a bit of every day and work towards that. But above all, stay optimistic, as I think I've tried to suggest here.
Well, yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to end with you, Andrew, because I think that's a great note to end on. I don't know if we've answered the question we set out at the beginning after the Biden-Xi handshake. Has U.S. China climate collaboration, is it back on track? And I don't think we've solved the questions of climate change or U.S. China collaboration on climate change. But I think this discussion has been a great example of what can happen when we're open-minded and we talk to each other and we discuss issues across the Pacific with a view of our common humanity and ways to make it better for our children. So thank you very much to Elizabeth, to Professor Lee, to Andrew, and to Marjin for some really enlightening and informative commentary on a huge range of really important subjects. Thank you to the China Institute and the China Project sister organization, Cerica, for hosting this event in its Next Gen Leaders Circle series. And thank you very much to all of our audience for tuning in. And have a great morning or a great evening wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Jeremy. Thank you. Bye-bye.